can just hear the blades and you're intimidated. It makes me feel very safe to be in an aircraft that I know can protect me.
Using extraordinary archive film and color reenactments, Battle Stations enters the lethal world of the Apache helicopter. In the early hours of the morning of January the 17th, 1991, a group of 6 AH-64 Apache helicopters of the 101st Aviation Regiment take off from the Saudi Arabian airbase of Al Jawf. Flying at 150 miles per hour, they slip undetected across the desert.
They cross the border at very low altitudes, probably no more than 100 feet AGL off the deck.
Their targets are the 2 principal Western Iraqi air defense installations. These sites, with their sophisticated radar towers, are constantly sweeping the skies, searching for attacking aircraft. But they have to be destroyed to open a gap in the Iraqi air defense net. The Apaches have only 90 minutes before 700 aircraft of the coalition forces will sweep through this gap to strike at over 500 tactical targets throughout Iraq.
And there was a specified time when missiles impacted both radar sites. And I believe that time was 0237 in the morning.
Although the Iraqi radar is constantly searching, they never see the low-flying helicopters. As the Apaches near their target, they descend to 50 feet.
And they closed on the objective. They started at about 8 kilometers.
The leader breaks radio silence with one short command: party in 10. At precisely 10 seconds before 0 hour, all 6 Apaches launch their Hellfire missiles. Each helicopter's primary target is his wingman's secondary. They cannot afford to let one piece of radar stay intact.
The entire process, or the engagement, took approximately about 10 minutes. It started with the Hellfire missile at about 8 kilometers, 2.75 rockets, and then 30 millimeters.
With just seconds to spare, the last building is destroyed, and the Apache leader calls out the code word to the oncoming coalition air forces.
The radar systems were down, the code word was passed to the incoming fixed-wing aircraft, and that was the start of Desert Storm.
The Apaches have succeeded in punching a 25-mile gap in the Iraqi early warning system. They have also fired the first shots of Operation Desert Storm, and in those first few minutes have established themselves as the vital aircraft to lead an attack. The use of a helicopter as a fighting weapon of war had begun only 40 years earlier. The helicopter had first flown as far back as the early 20th century, but it was during the Korean War in the 1950s that helicopters were first used by the US military as scouts. Few looked on them as war machines. It was because of their work evacuating the wounded that their reputation took off. Flying in terrible conditions, often under enemy fire, they would get the troops back to the MASH units, and a legend was born. But in 1962, a combat helicopter, the Bell XH-40, first went into the front line of battle. It was called the Huey. Able to carry 8 fully armed troops and with speeds of nearly 140 miles per hour, the Huey could take the fight to the enemy's door. With its 7.62 cannon, the US Army had something it never had before: a fast, multi-role front-line flying gun platform. To the enemy, the helicopter had become a fearsome adversary. To its own troops, it became as necessary to a fight as their own weapons. The helicopter had come of age. But by the end of the war, the Huey had become little more than a hefty flying tank, It put a premium on raw speed and firepower at the expense of agility and treetop operation. But the world was changing, and the 1970s were dominated by Cold War fears of a major conflict with the Soviet Union. The Army knew that the Soviet military had many more attack helicopters than the United States. They also had thousands of powerful tanks. The US Army asked a number of companies to come up with a new design of helicopter that could take on the might of the Soviet Union. There were two runners, the Bell AH-64 and the Hughes AH-64. Both were fast and durable, but which one was the best? They had just 2 years to build a prototype, and then it would be a face-off to decide which was the best helicopter in the world. During the early 1970s, America believed the threat from the Soviet Union was increasing. Their powerful helicopters and tanks were more than a match for the US Army's Huey. So the US threw out a challenge to its aircraft manufacturers to build the most powerful helicopter in the world. 2 aircraft companies responded and were racing to pit their helicopters against each other in a face-off to see who would be best. The prize would be a contract to build the US Army's frontline helicopter, and the contenders were the Bell AH-63 and the Hughes AH-64. The Bell was really just a bigger, badder Huey Cobra. The Hughes, on the other hand, was a totally new concept in helicopter design. With an overall length of 58 feet and a maximum weight of 21,000 pounds, it would be capable of both day and night flying. It was armor-plated with titanium, and its 2 powerful General Electric engines gave it a top speed of over 200 miles per hour. The crew sat in tandem, enclosed in a cocoon of titanium and Kevlar. The co-pilot gunner was in the front seat and the pilot in the rear. The cockpit was crammed with the most sophisticated electronics which guided the weapons, radar, and navigation. The weapons were to be missiles, rockets, and a 30mm cannon. The Hughes was the first in the air when on September the 30th, 1975, it made its maiden flight. 1 day later, the Bell took to the air. The fight was on. Over the following months, both helicopters were pushed to the limit as they were assessed and reassessed. Finally, on December the 10th, 1976, the winner was announced. It was the Hughes AH-64. It had been a close-run race, but the Hughes had clinched it on survivability, the strength to take punishment, give it back, and bring its crews home. Immediately, Hughes went into full production. On September the 30th, 1983, after 4,000 hours of flight testing, the first fully operational Apache helicopter was formally rolled out of the factory in Mesa, Arizona. And following the US Army's tradition of naming their aircraft after Native Americans, it had a new name, the AH-64 Apache. At last, the US Army had the helicopter it so desperately needed, and was ready to show the world what a powerful and dangerous aircraft it was. The main armament was 8 Hellfire anti-tank missiles. These laser-guided missiles had a range of 5 miles. It also carried 2 Hydra 70mm rocket pods. Although unguided, these armor-piercing general fragmentation rockets were used against targets which were hidden by terrain or other obstacles. Finally, it had a fearsome 30mm chain gun, capable of firing over 600 rounds per minute. Nothing gets away from this helicopter. But if the US Army had the finest helicopter in the world, they needed the cream of aviators to fly it, a special breed of attack pilots.
The person we're looking for an Apache pilot is an aggressive young man or woman that has great skills as far as motor skills, how to handle a very complex aircraft, tying together multiple systems. We want the killer instinct because it's an attack helicopter, and our job's to go out there and destroy the enemy.
And for that select group of pilots, the first impression of an Apache stayed forever in their minds.
My first instinct was, this thing's ugly. But it was ugly and menacing in a way that it's kind of scary looking.
The Apache is very sexy and very manly, and I just thought, if you're going to fly, that's the thing. You want to fly.
Dad called it a praying mantis. You just look at the front of this thing, and it's just sitting there like it's a dealer of death. And you just say, oh, I want to fly those.
For those privileged students that are selected to fly the best, then the training at Fort Rucker, Alabama, pushes them to be the best.
While it is difficult, it's not impossible, and that Army does a great job of building you up slowly but surely, so that when you leave the schoolhouse, now you're fully qualified to go out there and employ all the weapon systems to their fullest extent.
The guy who's number one in the class, they start an order of merit, and that guy gets this first pick of helicopter, and that's the way flight school is. There's 30 guys in the class, then they're numbered from 1 to 30, and they just go down a list and ask you what helicopter you'd like to fly.
But before they can graduate, there is a long road to travel between diploma and that first flight in the Apache.
And it's enormous. And you see the missile racks and the rocket pods and the gun, and you're just overwhelmed. It's incredible.
I liken it to if you're sitting on a dragon's back and you've got to pay attention to what the dragon's doing and work your reins, and if you don't pay attention, the dragon's going to turn around and bite your head off. It's the same thing.
It was absolutely amazing to have that much power and that much control over something that large and that amazing. and the Apache can do anything.
Getting into the Apache was like, this had tons of power, it's lots of fun, smooth, and just couldn't believe I was flying this thing, saying, oh man, this is sweet, just can't wait to get my hands on this thing. That aircraft was like driving a Ferrari, for crying out loud. It was absolutely awesome.
But it's not just flying the Apache that makes the grade. The student pilots must get to grips with some of the most sophisticated electronic systems ever seen on a helicopter. The weapon system on an Apache is operated by both the pilot and co-pilot and is called TADS, Target, Acquisition and Designation Site. Situated in the nose of the aircraft, it can turn through 120 degrees, feeding back direct view optics, infrared, high-resolution TV shots, and laser targeting. It is literally the eyes of the Apache. These images are displayed on the crew's HDUs, Helmet Display System, in the form of a 1-inch screen in front of their right eye. It is known as the green-eyed monster.
We call it the green-eyed monster because if you have it adjusted too bright, your eye is working too hard, and at the end of the flight, your muscles are sore in it, and it's a challenging system to fly in. It takes a lot. That's probably the most difficult thing to learn how to fly in the Apache.
The best way I can tell someone is if you put a green lens over the end of a toilet paper roll and look through that toilet paper roll driving down the highway at 100 miles an hour and try to look and see what you're seeing at nighttime. It's kind of that, it's a very difficult feeling, and it's almost impossible to convey to anyone else until you actually see it.
With all this information bombarding the pilot's eye, it takes over 200 hours of practice before they even become at ease with it. But even more amazing is that working in combination with the helmet display unit, the guns can be fired without aiming the aircraft. On each side of the pilot's helmet are sensors, that send a signal via infrared beams. Every movement that the pilot makes is picked up by these beams and transmitted to a computer, which in turn moves the cannon. Wherever the pilot looks, the cannon is aimed.
Engaging. And now we're engaging. Good shot.
If we're flying along and we take fire off of our right side, for example, and we have to suppress quickly, the gun follows your head. So you look to your right, you pull the trigger, and of course develop the situation.
Target destroyed.
Also packed into this incredible machine are state-of-the-art navigational aids, electronic countermeasures, and radar. Finally, after all this training, on graduation day, the man or woman knows that they have joined one of the most exclusive aviator clubs in the world.
Apache pilots, when they graduate from flight school, they truly are the best trained pilots in the world.
I was the only female in any of my classes in flight school. It's amazing to be able to say, I'm an Apache pilot, I fly a longbow, and you see people's heads roll. No way, you're a girl, you can't do that. But we can, and we do it pretty well.
I did feel like I was entering into a special band, a brotherhood in the Apache community. It is pretty special to be part of a group of guys and gals that fly the most advanced aircraft in the world.
As more and more Apaches were rushed into service, the pilots would prove they were the best in the world. When in December 1989, the Apache had its baptism of fire, going into harm's way for the first time. By the late 1980s, the Apache was regarded as the most lethal helicopter in the world. The Army could not get enough of these fearsome aircraft. But it had never been proven in battle. All this would change in December 1989. Throughout the late 1980s, tensions between the US and the Panama Republic were reaching breaking point. Under the leadership of its self-styled dictator, Manuel Noriega, the pressure built up and culminated in the shooting of a US Marine. In response, President George Bush Sr. declared war.
I have no higher obligation than to safeguard the lives of American citizens. And that is why I directed our armed forces to protect the lives of American citizens in Panama and to bring General Noriega to justice in the United States.
President Bush sent a large armed invasion force, over 27,000 men. Among this force, codenamed Operation Just Cause, were the Apaches. Their task was to go in under cover of darkness and give supporting fire to the troops on the ground. During the brief but intense fighting, Apaches unleashed their Hellfire and Hydra missiles against the heavily armed buildings surrounding Noriega's HQ. After 7 days, Noriega had been captured, and the Apaches had had their baptism of fire. They had proved themselves in battle, especially during night operations. Its ability to launch Hellfires into heavily defended targets had provided the commanders with valuable information on how to use the Apache in the future. That information came into force when in 1991 the Apaches were called into action again. On January the 17th, Operation Desert Storm began. After their successful first action against the Iraqi early warning radar sites, no action was planned without the Apache. From supporting troops on the ground to taking out tanks, the Apache was always in the thick of the action. Never shirking from a fight. It was everywhere.
In the Gulf War, we did a lot of reconnaissance and security missions. There was one mission I can remember on 27 February 1991, where we were instructed to take out various targets near a causeway. And it was a very hasty mission, one that was planned in 15 minutes. You take your elements, you go here, kill as much as you can, and don't lose anybody.
But the Apache worked hard for its success, which does not come without a price to pay. It was designed to fight a war in Europe, and the heat and dust in the desert caused nightmares for the crew chiefs and maintenance teams.
The dirt and dust were difficult, but soldiers, you gotta love them. They always come up with ingenious ways to do things. Some of the guys made emergency requisitions for pantyhose and nylons back home, and we covered up some of the ducting of the aircraft to prevent the sand and dust from getting into the computers and sensitive components. We used sponges, we used shop towels. There was all sorts of things that soldiers improvised to use to make the weapon systems work good.
The one that affected the pilots the most was the sand hitting up against the glass. It would make, it's like sandblasting glass, so you get all these little peck marks all across the glass. Blades going through the air with sand, it was sandblasting it 10 times faster than a sandblaster would ever work on metal or paint. So we continually painted the blades just to slow down the progress. Anything with oil was soon an oily mud, and it would rub, and it would bear down, go down straight to the metal.
Working around the clock, the maintenance crews were always there, tending the Apache, ready at a moment's notice to send them back into battle.
Well, an instant before they take off, everything that's running through my mind is what maintenance everybody's done on it. And did you do this, did you do that? And you're basically running through everything you've done since the last flight at a quick speed, and all the highlights, and making sure that you did that, making sure you did that. You wish them well, and you wait for them to come home.
On February the 27th, the Apache hit the Basra Road. Along with the A-10 attack aircraft, they swept down on the Iraqi convoy. Time after time, they fired their missiles, rockets, and cannon into the Iraqi vehicles. The troops had nowhere to hide and nowhere to run. When the attack was over, thousands of Iraqi vehicles were destroyed, and many thousands of Iraqi soldiers were killed. The Basra Road will forever be known as the Highway of Death. The Apache had become the most feared aircraft in the war, and their battle tally was immense. 278 tanks and 500 light and armored vehicles destroyed. 120 artillery sites and 42 SAM sites destroyed. They also assist in capturing over 4,700 Iraqi troops. The Apache was now known as the most terrifying attack helicopter in the world. But its reputation would grow even stronger when, after 9/11, it is hurled as an avenging angel against the terrorist factions in Afghanistan. The Apache had been the success story of the Gulf War and had proved itself time and again as the deadliest helicopter in the world. Whatever the military chiefs wanted, the Apache gave it to them. But it was not only a killing machine. It could also be used as a peacemaker. During the boiling cauldron that was the former Yugoslavia, the Apache was called on as part of the NATO forces to keep the peace between the warring factions of the Serbs and Muslims of Bosnia and Kosovo. But the role it was designed for, as a destroyer, came back with a vengeance after 9/11. With the world stunned into shock, the Apache was made ready to take the fight back to Afghanistan.
The images of 9/11 were very fresh in people's minds, and so we knew we were going to Afghanistan, and we knew that was the Taliban's home. And so everybody was fired up, everybody knew what their job was, and we were ready to go, and we were ready to take it to them.
By October 2001, the Apaches were doing what they do best, supporting ground troops in the relentless advance to Kabul. But this was not going to be a walk in the park. the Taliban were putting up fierce resistance.
They were very willing to fight. They were there to fight to the death, and they did that very well. They were very well armed, very well equipped, and ready to fight against us. I don't think they really knew the effectiveness of the Apache at the time, and I think we were one of the reasons that we were able to keep as few guys get hurt as possible on our side, the infantrymen on the ground. But they were very well trained, very well equipped.
But it was during Operation Anaconda that the Apache was involved in some of the fiercest battles of its life. By March 2002, the Taliban had been driven from the plains of Afghanistan, and along with Al-Qaeda had holed up in the caves in the Shahi Kot mountains.
The hardest thing was actually finding them. Once you got on top of them, if you could see any kind of movement or if you could see some sort of color that differentiated them from the background, it wasn't that hard to find them. But the initial acquisition of them was always very difficult. The easiest way to find the guys was if they were actually moving, and getting them out of their caves was practically impossible. And when the infantry would call us in, a lot of times we would not be able to find the guys at all, to be perfectly honest. And until we got them to move, it was very difficult to see them.
It was in trying to prise the Taliban from those caves that some of the bloodiest fighting of the war occurred. Flying through a hail of bullets and rocket-propelled grenades, Apaches sliced through the thin mountain air, pouring rocket and gunfire onto the enemy in their caves.
My personal weapon of choice was, I like rockets, point-detonating rockets, the 2.75-inch folding-fin arrow rockets. We were very limited on 3mm, but as far as something on an attack, me personally, I shot more rockets than I did anything else.
Where's that fire coming from?
There's no less than 23 people yelling over the same radio that they need Apache support. You have to separate all this radio chatter, and at the same time you're working out your tactics on how you're going to engage these targets. And by the way, you're having to get so close that the enemy is engaging you with automatic weapons fire with machine guns. So that's how you're used to being able to sit off at 4 or 5 miles. Now you're right in the middle of it, so it's your eyeball and your reflexes against the guy on the ground.
For the defenders in their caves, the Apache had become the force to fear. For the troops on the ground, they were their guardian angels.
Well, our troops love them. It's a security blanket for it. Whenever there was an attack, the first call they would make was to us. If a convoy was attacked, or a mission was attacked, or an IED exploded, the first call they would make would be to our TOC and say, can you get Apaches out there?
I think a lot of the guys on the ground truly fell in love with the Apache at the time, because we took a lot of fire for those guys, and we took a lot of heat off of them. We were able to get rid of a lot of guys that were, putting mortars on top of them, shooting them with machine guns and stuff like that. And even when we weren't actually shooting these guys, a lot of times we were taking fire away from them by being over top of their heads.
But it is the helicopter crew's own special bond to each other that bolsters their reputation to legendary heights. During one mission to provide support to the special forces on the ground, one Apache took a hit from an RPG.
We were doing right-hand racetrack patterns, firing rockets in 30mm at a mortar position and chasing some guys down the side of a mountain. For some reason, on our third pass, my wingman made a left turn, and when he did, he had rounds come through the cockpit, he had some shrapnel hit him in the knee, and that's when he got also hit with the RPG and exploded and took out the transmission lines.
Knowing that they were both badly shot up, the two Apaches made for base, but they didn't get very far. In one of the aircraft's cockpit, warning lights came on, indicating that there was no fluid left in its transmission. Still within range of the Al-Qaeda positions, both Apaches landed in a dried-up riverbed.
There were still mortar fire going on in the vicinity where they were landing, so things were still blowing up when they landed. They were only on the ground just long enough for basically just put some fluid in that transmission.
Putting in what little fluid there was, the crews had a difficult decision to make. The Apache was designed to fly with a dry transmission for a limited time, but could they get this one home before it gave out? The commander of the second Apache decided that as he was the more experienced pilot, he would fly the stricken helicopter back to base. With the Apache leaking like a sieve and still under fire, the commander took off, gambling against the odds that he could nurse the aircraft home.
He ended up flying 26 minutes with no fluid whatsoever in the transmission. The airframe's capable of flying 30 minutes like that, and he tested it out fairly well, like on 26 minutes. And again, they got both those damaged airframes back to the FARP. I think it's a testament to the engineers that built this airframe, the survivability of it. I just don't see another airframe being able to handle the damage that an Apache can and still keep the crew alive.
The war in Afghanistan had proved that the Apache helicopter was the finest in the world. But it was nearly 20 years old, and although it had always taken the fight to the enemy, the US Army felt that it needed an upgraded version to make it even better. Throughout its life, the Apache had undergone many updates, but during the mid-1990s, a new Apache was coming online, the AH-64D, the longbow Apache. Although very similar in appearance to the old 64A model, the longbow Apache is a 21st century, state-of-the-art, digital helicopter.
The most significant difference is when you look at the cockpit, you notice you have 2 television screens in each cockpit. You don't have those in the Alpha model. In the longbow, you do. And the greatest benefit that all the systems add to you is situational awareness. We can plug in routes, we can put phase lines, we can put enemy locations, we can put friendly locations, and all have that all displayed on a tactical situation display. You pop that up, and that gives you unbelievable situational awareness. When you're flying an Alpha model, if you're flying around an area and you're fighting the enemy and you're taking cover, you may have a possibility to say for a second, okay, where are me? Let me get my bearings about me. In the longbow, it's instantaneous. You look at the screen, say, I got it.
This aircraft has a Hellfire missile that's a fire and forget missile, which allows you to basically, once you determine what your target's going to be and you've sent the information, the data of that target to the missile, you can fire that missile and drive on to the next target, take a look at your next target without seeing the actual impact of that missile on the target.
The longbow has a new and greatly improved radar navigation system, coupled with adverse weather fighting capabilities. In addition to all these improvements, the aircraft is also able to detect and classify more than 128 targets, prioritize the 16 most dangerous, transmit this information to other aircraft, and initiate a precision attack, all in less than 30 seconds.
We do digital call for fires with the guys on the ground, the artillery guys on the ground, where before we'd have to do that over a radio in the helicopter. Now we can, with a few button pushes, we can do all that, basically kind of like email. You know, digital communications is a big advantage of the longbow.
The longbow is now the most expensive and complex weapons system operated by the US Army. And the proof, if proof was really needed of how good it is, was when a head-to-head contest was held between it and the older AH-64 Apache. Held at Fort Hunter Liggett in California, the two Apaches went at each other. The final score was amazing. The old AH-64 was credited with 75 kills on adversary targets. The longbow, 300. Now this super new killing machine was ready to show its power. On March the 20th, 2003, Operation Iraqi Freedom began.
Oh boy, Operation Iraqi Freedom. A lot of boredom, and then you mix in a lot of sheer terror, a lot of excitement mixed in with it.
Flying with the 5th Army Corps, the new longbows again took the point position of any attack, supporting troops, destroying tanks and armored vehicles, and going into harm's way any time the military wanted it to.
A lot of times, we didn't know exactly what mission we were going to do. So we would be on a quick reaction force, and we would get called up and be able to launch within an hour, 30 minutes to an hour. we'd just be learning what our mission was as we were running up the aircraft, listening to the radios.
One of the best telltale signs of how effective the Apache was is anytime we were providing ground convoy security, aerial escort, or VIP security, not a single attack took place. That's how scared the enemy was of the Apache. They knew that we shot pretty straight and were accurate, and the firepower that we could bring was pretty big. A little bit more than their AKs that they were firing.
But it wasn't all one-sided. The enemy could hit back, and hit hard, as the night of March the 23rd would show. The military planners had known that if Baghdad was to be taken, then the Iraqi Republican Guard and the Medina division situated in the west of the capital had to be taken out. The plan called for a low-level helicopter attack, and Apaches were selected.
I was the lead aircraft in my troop. It was myself, the commander, and then the squadron commander behind us. But then when they said, hurry up, jump in your aircraft, let's go, we're going against the Medina division, and we kind of went, wait a minute, okay, how many tanks and how many aircraft, and do we know where they are?
As they approached the heavily populated suburbs of Baghdad, the Apaches were caught in a firestorm of resistance.
About 25 minutes into the flight, we started receiving fire. The fire it started coming from, initially it was unaimed. It started coming from some of the waterways. It was coming from some of the cars that had pulled over, some of the houses, but it was initially unaimed.
And at first we didn't know what it was. I mean, we were so naive. We were thinking, we know the mission, we've got the big aircraft, we're going in, Apaches, here we come, watch out. And all of a sudden, the pings started hitting the aircraft, and we kind of, I'm asking my back, what do you think that is? Oh, I think it's a bird strike. And then another one hit, and then another one hit, and we were going, yeah, those aren't birds. Those are people shooting at us.
The rounds came from the left, they came from the right, underneath and in front of you. And it was absolutely, positively amazing fireworks show. Except for it wasn't a fireworks show in front of you, they were aiming at you.
The Apaches were flying into a carefully planned, low-tech ambush. The Baghdad power grid was turned off for 2 seconds, the signal for the Iraqis on the ground to open up with everything they had: small arms, machine guns, and RPGs.
As soon as the lights came back on, the amount of fire intensified extremely. And we later found out that that was their way of communicating the fact that when the lights in the city go out, everybody's to come out of their house and just fire into the air because there was an air attack taking place.
And there were people that were coming up on the roofs or coming out their doors and just shooting at us and then running back inside. And so we never even saw them. I mean, I'd hear it and I'd know it was coming from, but we were flying 120 knots, and by the time we'd take the round, the guy was behind me. So I'd be doing this, looking everywhere for these people that were shooting at us.
We were flying at 50 feet, hopping over light poles and telephone wires. And we got up to the engagement area and decided that because of the intensity of the ground fire that we were facing, that we weren't going to be able to maneuver in zone. And that same ground fire that we experienced on the way up was the same stuff that we had to go back through.
Now the Iraqis knew that the Apaches were coming back and were ready to take them on.
By the time we got up to the release point where we were supposed to go, we figured we were probably pretty ineffective at that point. And then when they said, turn around and go back, and we went, there's no way I want to fly back through that. And we didn't have any other route to go down, so we just tried to alter our route back, and it was just, it was horrible.
My aircraft, in fact, received fire that the rounds struck the underneath of the aircraft, and it actually shot out our TAD's power supply, and I lost TAD's picture altogether. Essentially, if you imagine driving down the road 100 miles an hour on a pitch black night and you turn off the lights in your car, it's the same feeling. We had no night systems at that point in time.
The worst part about it was hearing the other air crews on the radios. When the one pilot took the round in the neck, and he was screaming on the radio, I don't know where I am, I don't know where I'm going, I don't know what to do. He was just, and you could just hear the fear in their voices over the radio, and that was the scariest part.
As a cavalry trooper, as an attack pilot, you're kind of full of piss and vinegar. There were some times that my pucker factor definitely went up, to be honest with you. There was times where the ground fire was so intense and we were so low that I could hear the AK-47 going off beneath me. But even though that happened, I wasn't scared, and I didn't think that my number would come up. Maybe that's just sheer bravado, maybe that's stupidity, or maybe that's just confidence in the job that I was doing.
Nearly every Apache was damaged by gunfire, but every one got back safely to base, a tribute to the survivability of this unique aircraft.
Just a sheer miracle that everybody made it back that night in one piece. And I owe a lot of that to the aircraft, and 50% to the aircraft and 50% to the professionalism of the pilots that flew it that night.
The ability to take punishment and the power to give it back has earned the Apache a place in the record books as the finest helicopter in the world.
If anything, Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom proved the Apache's the best attack helicopter in the world. Killed over 3 divisions worth of Iraqi equipment. It's flown over 75,000 combat hours in both those theaters. And at the whole time maintaining over an 80% fully mission capable rate, being able to launch a mission, come back, recover, and launch again.
Over 1,300 of these fighting machines have been built, and 10 countries to date have Apaches as their principal attack helicopter. The US Army think it's so good that it is to remain on the service books until at least 2030. To the men and women that fly it, the Apache will forever stay in their hearts.
I absolutely love the Apache. It is a phenomenal aircraft. I can't think of any better aircraft to be flying. I'm living my dream right now. Love flying that.
I'm biased. The Apache is the best attack helicopter in the world. I've flown it for 15 years. It's extremely, it's the greatest aircraft I've ever seen. I'm extremely proud to be an Apache pilot, and I don't think there's any comparison to any aircraft in the world.
I would say that, the part it holds is more than just my heart. I mean, it's my character. It's who I am.